For 20 years, he woke before sunrise, looked down the empty road, and waited for the man who murdered his past to finally ride home. The town of Red Hollow sat in a bowl of dust and silence, tucked between dry hills that swallowed sound and memory alike. It was the kind of place travelers forgot the moment they rode past it. A few crooked wooden buildings, a tired saloon with a leaning porch, a church bell that rarely rang anymore. But for one man, Red Hollow was not forgettable. It was a prison, made of time. Every morning before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, Daniel Mercer stepped onto the porch of his small ranch house. The boards creaked the same way they had for 20 years. The wind carried the same dry smell of sage and dust. And the road stretching toward town remained just as empty as it had been the day before. Daniel always looked down that road, and every morning he expected to see a rider. The townsfolk had stopped asking questions years ago. At first they whispered about him in the saloon. A man who rarely spoke. A rancher who never left town. A widower who carried the quiet weight of something no one could quite name. Some said grief, others said madness. But the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. Daniel Mercer was waiting. 20 years earlier, Red Hollow had been louder, busier, full of cattle drives and whiskey fights, and men who believed tomorrow would always come. Daniel had been one of them then, younger, faster. A man who laughed easily and believed justice was something you could still find in a sheriff's badge. That belief died on a hot summer afternoon. A gunshot in the street, a man riding away, and a life broken so completely that the pieces never fit together again. The outlaw who pulled that trigger vanished before the dust settled. Some said he was killed in a border skirmish. Others swore he joined a gang somewhere deep in the territories. But Daniel Mercer never believed any of those stories. Because men like that didn't disappear. They returned, and for 20 years, Daniel Mercer woke every morning with the same quiet promise in his chest. One day, the road would bring him back. And when it did, Red Hollow would finally remember the sound of a gunshot. 20 years earlier. Red Hollow had been a different town. The streets were louder then. Wagon wheels rattled across hard dirt. Cattlemen argued over whiskey inside the saloon. Dust still hung in the air, but it carried the smell of work, not abandonment. And Daniel Mercer had once been a different man. He wasn't a rancher back then. Not yet. He was the deputy sheriff of Red Hollow, a young lawman who believed rules could tame the wild edges of the frontier. People trusted him. Shopkeepers nodded when he walked by. Ranchers tipped their hats. He had a steady hand, a clear mind, and something rare in places like Red Hollow, patience. But what truly made Daniel different was what waited for him at home. Her name was Sarah Dot. She had come to Red Hollow with a wagon train from Missouri, bringing with her the kind of warmth that softened even the roughest corners of the town. She laughed easily, she spoke plainly, and somehow she managed to turn a small wooden house on the edge of town into something that felt like a future for Daniel Mercer. The frontier suddenly felt less lonely. They married during the spring, beneath a sky so wide it made promises feel permanent. For a while, life moved quietly forward. Daniel worked long days beside Sheriff Caleb Ward. Sarah planted a garden behind their home. In the evenings, the two of them would sit on the porch and watch the orange glow fade over the hills. It could have stayed that way, but the frontier had a way of drawing trouble, like dry grass draws sparks. The man who brought it to Red Hollow arrived one late afternoon. His name was Victor Kane. He rode into town alone, wearing a long dark coat that carried the dust of a dozen territories. His horse moved slow but steady, like it already knew the rhythm of places where guns decided the law. Most men, arriving in Red Hollow, stopped at the saloon first. Victor Kane didn't. He rode straight down the center of the street, eyes moving calmly from building to building, measuring the town the way a gambler studies cards. People felt it immediately. The quiet confidence, the kind of stillness that often followed men who had survived too many gunfights. Sheriff Ward noticed it too. Daniel stood beside him outside the jailhouse as Kane dismounted. There was no shouting, no immediate trouble. Just a brief conversation between strangers that felt heavier than it should have. Kane claimed he was only passing through, a traveler, a man looking for work with cattle drives farther south. Sheriff Ward didn't fully believe him, but the frontier ran on thin evidence, then thinner patience. A man couldn't be arrested simply for looking dangerous, so Kane stayed. Days turned into weeks. He drank at the saloon, played cards, and spoke very little. Yet slowly, something changed in Red Hollow. Fights broke out more often. Drifters started appearing in town, men who seemed to know Kane from places no one in Red Hollow had ever heard of. Sheriff Ward grew uneasy. Daniel did too. But the real danger didn't reveal itself until the day Victor Kane decided he no longer wanted to pretend. He was just passing through. That afternoon began like any other. The sun was high, the street was full, and Daniel Mercer had no idea it would be the last ordinary moment of his life. The trouble began with a land dispute. At least, that was how it appeared on the surface. A rancher named Thomas Calloway rode into town one hot afternoon, furious and shaking with anger. His cattle had been driven off during the night, fences cut, tracks leading south into the dry hills. Calloway knew exactly who he blamed: Victor Kane. The accusation spread through Red Hollow, faster than wildfire through dry grass. Men gathered outside the saloon, voices rising, boots grinding dust into the street. Kane sat at a table inside, calm as ever, turning a whiskey glass slowly between his fingers. When Sheriff Ward and Daniel Mercer stepped into the saloon, the room went quiet. Ward asked the question plainly. "Kane, you know anything about those cattle?" Victor Kane leaned back in his chair, studying the sheriff with the lazy patience of a man who had already measured everyone in the room. Then he smiled, a slow, humorless expression. "No, Sheriff," Kane said, "but I do know something about accusations." The tension in the room tightened like a rope pulled too far. Calloway stepped forward, hand hovering near his revolver. The rancher was a big man, but anger had already clouded his judgment. "You stole from me," he growled. Kane didn't move, didn't reach for his gun. He simply stared. And somehow, that stillness made the room feel even more dangerous. Sheriff Ward stepped between them before anything could happen. "No gunfights in my town," he said firmly. For a moment, it seemed the situation might dissolve into nothing more than angry words. But Kane had already accomplished something far more important. He had planted fear. Over the next few weeks, strange things continued happening around Red Hollow. Livestock disappeared. Wagons were robbed along nearby trails. Drifters connected to Kane drifted in and out of town like shadows. Yet nothing could be proven. Every accusation dissolved into uncertainty. Sheriff Ward grew increasingly frustrated. Without evidence, the law was powerless. Daniel Mercer watched it all carefully. The pattern was clear to him. Victor Kane wasn't just committing crimes. He was testing the town. Testing its limits. Testing the men who tried to control it. Then, one evening, the situation changed. Daniel returned home after a long patrol, just as the sun dipped low behind the hills. The sky burned orange and red, casting long shadows across the quiet edge of town. Sarah was on the porch, waiting, but something in her expression felt wrong, uneasy. She told Daniel that earlier that afternoon, Victor Kane had ridden past their house, slowly, watching. He hadn't spoken a word, but he had looked at her long enough to leave a chill behind. Daniel felt anger rise in his chest immediately, not fear. Anger. Because men like Kane didn't simply pass by homes without reason. They were sending messages. That night, Daniel barely slept. By morning, he had made a quiet decision. Victor Kane needed to be stopped. Sheriff Ward agreed. They would confront him. Not with accusations, but with a warning. What neither of them understood yet was that Victor Kane had already chosen the moment he wanted this quiet little town to break. And when that moment came, it wouldn't begin with a robbery. It would begin with a gunshot. The day everything shattered began under a bright, merciless sun. Red Hollow was busy that afternoon. Wagons creaked through the main street. Ranch hands drifted between the general store and the saloon. The heat pressed down on the town like a heavy hand. Daniel Mercer stood outside the sheriff's office with Sheriff Ward, discussing plans to finally drive Victor Kane out of town. They had decided the night before. No more warnings. Kane would be told to leave Red Hollow by sunset, or face arrest. It seemed simple, until a rider appeared at the far end of the street. Victor Kane. He rode slowly into town, his dark coat moving gently in the wind. But this time, he wasn't alone. Two rough-looking men followed behind him, both carrying rifles across their saddles. The street grew quiet. People stepped aside as the three riders approached the center of town. Sheriff Ward moved first. He walked into the street, his badge catching the sunlight. "That's far enough," he called. Kane stopped his horse. For a moment, no one spoke. The wind pushed dust across the road. A saloon door creaked somewhere behind them. Ward rested his hand near his revolver. "You've caused enough trouble. Here," the sheriff said. "You and your friends are leaving Red Hollow today." Kane tilted his head slightly, studying the sheriff like a man examining something mildly interesting. Then his gaze shifted. Past Ward, past Daniel. Toward the small house near the edge of town. Toward Sarah Mercer, who had just stepped outside. After hearing the commotion, Daniel felt a cold warning run through his chest. "Sarah," he started. The gunshot cut him off. The sound cracked through the town like lightning splitting the sky. For a moment, no one moved. Sarah Mercer collapsed onto the wooden steps of her porch. Victor Kane lowered his revolver slowly, smoke curling from the barrel. The street froze in stunned silence. Daniel Mercer stood in the dust, unable to breathe, because in that single second, Victor Kane hadn't just fired a gun. He had destroyed Daniel Mercer's entire life. For a few seconds after the gunshot, Red Hollow stopped breathing. No one moved, no one spoke. Daniel Mercer stared at the porch of his home, where Sarah lay motionless against the wooden boards she had scrubbed clean just that morning. The world felt distant, like he was watching it through thick glass. Then the sound returned. Someone screamed. A horse panicked. Boots hit the dirt as townspeople scattered in every direction. Daniel barely heard any of it. He was already running. The distance between the sheriff's office and his house had never felt so long. Every step felt heavy, like the ground itself was trying to hold him back. When he reached the porch, he dropped to his knees beside her. Sarah's eyes were open, but the warmth that once filled them was fading fast. Her hand trembled weakly. In Daniel tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Behind him, the town erupted into chaos. Sheriff Ward shouted orders. Men ran for their rifles. Someone fired a warning shot down the street, but Victor Kane was already moving. By the time Daniel looked up, Kane and the two riders were galloping out of Red Hollow, dust rising behind them like smoke from a battlefield. Sheriff Ward organized a pursuit within minutes. Half a dozen riders chased Kane into the hills. They never caught him by nightfall. The search parties returned empty-handed. Victor Kane had vanished into the frontier, leaving behind nothing but silence. And a grave. Sarah Mercer was buried 2 days later, beneath a small cottonwood tree outside town. Nearly the entire population of Red Hollow attended the funeral. But Daniel Mercer did not speak. Not to the sheriff, not to the preacher, not to the townspeople who tried to offer sympathy. Something inside him had changed the moment. Sarah fell onto those wooden steps. The man who believed in law, in patience, in the slow fairness of justice, had died with her. Sheriff Ward tried to convince Daniel to join the manhunt that continued for weeks afterward, but Daniel refused. Instead, he resigned as deputy. He sold most of his belongings, and he bought a small ranch on the edge of town. From that day forward, Daniel Mercer became a quiet man who spoke little and worked alone. The townspeople believed time would eventually dull the pain. They were wrong. Because Daniel Mercer wasn't trying to forget what happened. He was preparing for the day it returned. Every morning, he woke before sunrise. Every morning, he stepped onto his porch. And every morning, he looked down the same empty road, waiting. Not for closure, not for healing, but for Victor Kane to make the one mistake Daniel Mercer knew he eventually would. Coming back. 20 years is a long time for a man to carry anger. Most people believed Daniel Mercer's hatred would have faded. Time had a way of softening memories, turning sharp wounds into quiet scars, but the townspeople of Red Hollow misunderstood something important. Daniel Mercer had never allowed time to heal him. He had used it every year, every season, every sunrise. Had been another layer of patience built over a single promise, and one cold autumn morning, the road finally answered him. Daniel stepped onto his porch, the same way he had thousands of times before. The wind was thin and dry, carrying the smell of dust and distant cattle. At first, the road looked empty. Then he saw it, a rider, far away at the edge of the hills, moving slowly toward town. Daniel didn't react immediately. His eyes simply followed the figure as it grew clearer with every passing minute. The horse walked with the tired rhythm of a long journey, and the man in the saddle wore a dark coat, older now, weathered, but unmistakable. Victor Kane had returned to Red Hollow. Word spread quickly through the town. A few people recognized him immediately. Others sensed trouble in the way Daniel Mercer walked down the road toward the main street without saying a word. For 20 years, Daniel had never entered town unless absolutely necessary. Today, he walked straight down the center of the street. By the time Victor Kane reached the saloon, the town had already begun gathering at a distance. No one spoke. The two men faced each other across the dusty street. Kane dismounted slowly, studying Daniel with a tired curiosity. Time had changed both of them. Daniel's hair was streaked with gray now. The quickness of youth had settled into something colder, more deliberate. Kane looked older too, but the confidence remained in his posture. The same quiet arrogance that had once ruled Red Hollow through fear. For a long moment, neither man reached for a gun. Then Kane smiled faintly. "Well," he said calmly, his voice rough with age, "looks like you're still here." Daniel's expression didn't change. "I told myself you'd come back," Daniel replied. Kane glanced around the silent town. "You waited 20 years for this." Daniel nodded once. "Yes." The wind stirred dust between them. Kane studied Daniel more carefully now, and something shifted in his expression. Perhaps realization, perhaps regret, or perhaps he simply understood the truth of the moment. There was no escape left. Slowly, Kane's hand moved toward his revolver. Daniel's hand moved to Dot. For 20 years, Daniel Mercer had imagined this moment. He had replayed the gunshot that killed Sarah thousands of times in his mind. But when the draw finally came, it lasted less than a second. 2 guns cleared leather. 1 shot echoed through Red Hollow. Victor Kane staggered backward. The revolver slipped from his hand as he collapsed into the dust of the same street where he had destroyed a life too. Decades earlier, the town stood frozen as the dust settled around the ace. Fallen outlaw Daniel Mercer lowered his gun. For the first time in 20 years, the road was empty again. Victor Kane's body lay in the dust for several minutes before anyone moved. The town of Red Hollow watched from porches, windows, and the edges of the street. Some of them had waited years for this moment. Others had only heard the old stories whispered in the saloon late at night. But now the legend had ended. Sheriff Eli Ward, the son of the sheriff who once stood beside Daniel Mercer, slowly stepped forward and checked the fallen outlaw. There was no doubt Victor Kane was dead. The wind pushed a thin wave of dust across the street, partially covering the man who had once terrorized the town. Time had finally caught him in the place where it all began. Sheriff Ward looked up at Daniel. For a moment, the younger sheriff seemed unsure what to say. After all, the man standing in front of him had just finished a story that began before Ward himself was even old enough to hold a gun. That Daniel Mercer didn't wait for questions. He holstered his revolver calmly. The anger that had lived in his chest for 2 decades was gone now, not replaced by relief. Not even satisfaction, just silence. Without another word, Daniel turned and began walking back down the road toward his ranch. The townspeople stepped aside quietly as he passed. Some watched him with respect, others with a kind of sadness, because everyone in Red Hollow understood something now. Daniel Mercer had not spent 20 years chasing revenge. He had spent 20 years carrying the weight of a promise. And when that promise was finally fulfilled, it left nothing behind but an empty road and a man who no longer had a reason to wait. Some men chase revenge for a lifetime. Others become it. Daniel Mercer waited 20 years for justice. But in the end, revenge didn't bring peace. It only closed a wound that time refused to heal. If you enjoy dark, untold stories from the Wild West, stories of patience, betrayal, and the men history almost forgot, subscribe to Whispers of the West, where every legend still echoes in the dust.